I will say that I'm going to have slides, and a lot of the slides were taken by professional photographers. Tommy Laverne took a lot, and they're really good. And there are other photographers. And then I took some, and you can always tell the photographs I took. This one, this glary one here, is obviously one that I took. So I'm just telling you in advance, if you see one that looks to you ridiculously amateurish, don't blame Tommy. It was me. Now, let me just ask, how many were here on the Rice campus? I see some people rose and so forth. But so 6 or 8 people were here in 1990 when this occurred. So, right. So, if you were here, I hope that what I say rings true to you, although it may be that there be some aspects of the preparations and so forth that you didn't really know about. For those who weren't here, a lot that I say is going to seem ridiculous, but it's true. I'm not going to say a single thing that's not true. I won't necessarily say all that could be said about some things, because Rice signed a confidentiality statement, and I also agreed to that confidentiality statement. And how I got into this, obviously my research is really 18th century and 19th century South. But I was walking through Razor Hall one day. That ugly building is now being renovated. And Carl McDowell, some of you may remember Carl McDowell, who was sort of an icon figure here for years. And Carl walked through and he says to me, "What are you doing this summer in July?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to be giving some lectures in Colorado for 4 weeks." He says, "Well, I want you to stay here the second week of July." And I said, "Well, I've already committed to giving lectures." He said, "What are they paying you?" And I told him. He says, "Well, tell them to subtract 1/4 and we'll add 1/4 and you stay here." And I said, "Well, what is this about?" And he said, "Well, we're going to have an economic summit and I want you to write the history of it and I want you to interview everybody and look at all the archives and go to it." And I said, "Carl, I've already agreed to give these lectures." He said, "They asked you for 4 weeks. I'm telling you to go for 3 weeks and I'll make up the difference." And I realized pretty soon that I was going to be staying here. So I agreed. And so the deal was that I would have access, I would interview people in Houston and White House people and security people. Basically, I would have access to interview everybody who had something to do with the economic summit, and that I would have access to all the documentation. And I would be allowed on campus to see some things and go down to the press facilities and so forth. And then the deal was that then Carl said, 2 weeks, send me a 100-page booklet. I said, "Carl, you know, remember now, in the weeks right after this, I'm going back to Colorado to finish those 3 lectures. He says, "Well, 3 weeks." I did fax him. I mean, I did a FedEx back before I left about a 100-page manuscript, which was later turned into a book, a privately published book that many of you have never seen because it was privately published and privately distributed. But it was a book like this with about, I don't know, 100 pages of text and a lot of color photos that tells the kind of background history of the summit. And this book was distributed to donors and politicians and so forth, but was not publicly available. So if you ever see one in the bookstore, you ought to buy it because there are not many out there. So that's the reason I happen to do something which is not at all the kind of stuff that I normally do. Why did that start moving? And that's the reason that I was allowed to talk to people about security and so forth, because obviously there are a lot of security aspects that I was not supposed to talk about or write about until the event happened. I mean, if you just think about it, it's detrimental to security efforts for somebody to write about them in advance. So, and there were also, every time I give this talk, people ask me, "How much did it cost?" I'm not allowed to tell you how much it cost. And I always say this, that it cost maybe not as much as you expected, but a lot more than you would like to know. It didn't cost Rice very much. We may have ended up, well, I think we did actually, after some of the infrastructure stuff, we actually came out on top. But a huge amount of money was spent. Most of the money was spent through contributions, in kind and otherwise, by corporations and so forth, who found it advantageous to be very friendly to the White House. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Anyway, that's just some kind of a background. How did the Economic Summit get started? What actually is the Economic Summit? It's called the Economic Summit of Industrialized Nations. Well, the first one took place in 1975 in France. And it was held at a beautiful chateau called the Chateau Rambouillet. And Gerald Ford, who was president at that time, didn't want to go, thought it was sort of a waste of time or wouldn't achieve anything. And more or less against his better judgment, or certainly against his druthers, he went to this economic summit. And this economic summit consisted of the heads of state and the foreign ministers and the finance ministers of these nations: United States, England, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. After the second summit, Canada is allowed to join, and also an organization called the European Economic Community that was obviously a sort of a consortium of economic interest in Europe, but not an individual country. So thereafter, it consisted of those 7 nations: the United States, England, France, Italy, Germany, Japan, Canada, and the Economic Union. No one else has been asked to join. Now, I'm going to use the word heads of delegation later when I start talking about who comes. And you might think, why don't I say heads of state or something like that? Well, it turns out that according to very rigorous rules of protocol, some of them are not heads of state. I mean, President Bush was head of state, but Jacques Delors, who was the representative of the Economic Union, was not a head of state. And the Prime Minister of England is not the head of state. The Queen technically is. So you can't use, so the agreed upon sort of common denominator title is head of delegation. So, and this is going to be, this whole event is going to be done according to protocol to such an extent that sometimes it literally boggles the mind. But everything is done according to protocol. Okay, so Jerry Ford goes as the United States and the 5 other nations at Chateau de Rambouillet in France. Actually, he enjoys himself. And he thinks that some good came out of that economic summit. And so the person who least wanted to go, Gerald Ford, ended up saying, this is so successful, we ought to do it again, and the U.S. will host it the next time. And for some reason that puzzles me even to today, Gerald Ford agreed that when the U.S. hosted the economic summit, we would have it in Puerto Rico. I mean, nothing wrong with Puerto Rico, but it's not particularly U.S. So the second economic summit was Puerto Rico. And then the next one was in London. And then it just went in that order. And then after 7 years, it came back to France again. And then it was the United States' turn eventually again in 1989. 1983, our second time, it was Colonial Williamsburg, which seems a kind of a very American kind of place. And then, to London again through the cycle. And then in 1989, the economic summit was in Paris, was in France again. And everybody knew then that the next economic summit was the U.S.'s turn again. But no one had a clue where it would be. I mean, after all, Puerto Rico, Williamsburg, there's not much of a sequence there. The economic summit ended this third round, beginning of the third round, ended on Sunday, July the 16th, 1989. And as he was getting ready to come back to the United States, George Bush was in sort of a jovial mood and was joking and talking and sort of chatting to the reporters. Up until this time, there wasn't a clue where this next economic U.S. summit would be. And someone asked Bush, just almost jokingly, well, where will the next economic summit be in the United States? And he sort of quipped, Well, he said, just because I'm from Texas, and Secretary of State Baker is from Texas, and Secretary of Commerce Mossbecker is from Texas, don't take that to mean that it's going to be in Texas. And everybody laughed. And the paper reported the next morning, the Houston Post, Houston Chronicle said, you know, Bush says economic summit could be in Texas. Well, he did sort of jokingly suggest that, but he didn't really say that. But not a word had appeared in any Houston paper about the economic summit ever coming to Houston, except the Monday after Bush said that. There were headlines in both the Post and the Chronicle. And there was really almost feverish speculation. In the next 3 or 4 days, there were columns about what restaurants would be asked to serve food, and what parties, and who would be invited, and where would it be. And in Austin, the legislature has passed a resolution claiming Texas Economic Summit year. And it was just sort of, it sort of got out of hand. Saturday, the Saturday following the previous Sunday joking reference to the summit coming from Texas, Kathy Whitmire, who was then the mayor, announced that she was formulating a task force to sort of put together a plan that would be submitted to the White House to make the White House believe or understand or know that the only sensible place to have an economic summit was Houston. The next afternoon, that's July 23, a week after Bush had made his joking reference, a group of important sort of movers and shakers met in Lee Hogan's office in the 1100 Milam building. Lee Hogan was the president of the Houston Partnership. Houston Partnership was a sort of a composite economic development group that actually was in charge of the Houston Chamber of Commerce. And so Lee Hogan called together 8 or 10 influential Houstonians to meet in his office that Sunday afternoon. And they began to try to devise a strategy. But the first question to be answered was Bush serious? I mean, is there a possibility, however remote, that the economic summit could possibly be in Houston? How do we find that out? Well, they put together, they decided that everybody they could think of in Houston who had some political clout and who knew Bush or knew anyone near Bush in Washington, D.C., so that in the next week, telephone and fax and telegraph and however way they knew to find out, to ask, to kind of be, to sort of try to ferret out some answer to the question, is there a real possibility that it could come to Houston? And they agreed to meet the following Sunday, and everybody made all their phone calls, and made all their connections, and called in all their chits, and they'd try to figure it out. So the following Sunday, on July 30, they all again met in Lee Hogan's office in the Houston Partnership down in the 1100 Milam building, and they all talked, and every one of them decided that actually Bush was not just joking, he was actually serious, that there really was a good chance that the economic summit could come to Texas. But everybody still wasn't sure. They thought, well, they knew that in a couple of months that Secretary of State Baker was going to be meeting the Russian Edward Shevardnadze in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, to start talking about Bush was going to be meeting with Gorbachev in Malta. So this was sort of a preliminary discussion. It was in Jackson Hole. And they could just imagine Jackson Hole in the summer, Wyoming, those snow-capped mountains, and this is a summer event, and sort of Houston in July, and Jackson Hole, Wyoming. That was kind of worrisome. And they also thought, well, they knew that Governor John Sununu, remember Sununu, one of those names of the past? He also was a very important White House advisor, and he was from New Hampshire. And New Hampshire had, in the 1930s, had a very famous meeting called the meeting at Breton Woods. And so that was also a fear, some scenic little spot in cool New Hampshire, or some mountain scenic spot in Wyoming. But then they began to think about it. They said, no, actually, this is an event that is so big. I mean, there are all these heads of state and foreign ministers and finance ministers and economic advisors and, every imaginable kind of person, plus 4,000 or 5,000 journalists from around the world, plus 2,000 or 3,000 support personnel and security personnel. And they began to realize that if you begin to think of some place that's big enough in terms of hotel space, you could, a Jackson Hole is not big enough. And they also began to think about, and they began trying to get clues. Actually, the Bush people could, the last time there had been an economic summit was in the Reagan administration. And the Reagan people were not particularly friendly with the Bush people, so the Bush people couldn't get much information from the Reagan people. So they ended up talking to the Canadians. And the Canadians said, well, you know, there are a lot of things you have to think about. You need to have, there needs to be the availability of a really large international airport because journalists are going to be coming from all over the world. And you also need to be really near a military base because the president and most of the head of delegations are not going to be flying commercial planes, and they want to land at a military base. And so they began to realize we got Ellington, which is still can serve as a military base. That's, you know, between here and the Manned Space Center. And of course we've got what we call the big airport. And they also began to realize that you need to have a really significant medical center. And I will go on later to talk about how they plan for any conceivable medical disaster. But in order to have that kind of medical support as a background, you needed to be close to a really large medical center. And they also realized that because most of the nations were in Europe, if you move one further time zone to the west, it complicated prime TV transmittal back to Europe. And so Jackson Hole was disadvantaged by the fact that it was mountain time rather than central time. So anyway, they're kind of putting all this stuff together, and they convinced themselves, well, despite the cool snow of Jackson Hole and all that kind of stuff, Texas is a really good site. So now the competition is Dallas and Houston and San Antonio. They say, well, certainly we can beat out Dallas. San Antonio, though, is an old city, and the Europeans might like some old city. But then they begin to think about, well, San Antonio is old only compared to Houston, you know, like 1830. But when you talk about Rome or Paris, I mean, San Antonio is still a newcomer. And so what to us seems scenic and exotic and old means nothing to the Europeans. So in fact, a new futuristic city like Houston with modern skyscrapers and the Manned Spacecraft Center and, you know, the first word spoken from the moon, Houston, the eagle has landed. Well, actually, Houston has advantages over San Antonio, so we can do it. And so by June 30, they were quite certain that this was the obvious place and the only place to have an economic summit. The problem was, it wasn't what they thought, it's what somebody in the White House thought. So the committee met again in Lee Hogan's office. They said, okay, now we think that there are 6 people in Washington, D.C. who are going to make this decision. Obviously, it's President Bush, and it's James Baker, and it's Nicholas Brady, Secretary of Commerce Mosbacher, Brent Scowcrow, John Sununu, and a man named Sig Rogich. Sig Rogich. It's kind of an unusual name. Sounds like, you know. Anyway, he was assistant to the president for special activities. And of course, this is a special activity. So I said, okay, the people we have to convince are those 6 people. So they put together 6 committees in Houston. They thought of everybody in Houston they thought personally knew those 6 people. And for the next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks until the decision was making, each person on each committee was supposed to contact his person to say, Houston can do it, Houston can do it right, Houston wants it. I mean, basically just bug them till they're just wear them out. And we can get it. And so they set these 6 committees up to contact the 6 decision makers. They also put together a committee that consists of people from, you know, Southwest Bell and Continental Airlines and Metro and so forth, trying to get together a statement about how many taxis there are, how many hotel rooms, air connections, catering information. They have information about how much does it cost, you know, per glass of orange juice. I mean, it's unbelievably detailed kind of stuff, getting all this information together. And then they sort of made it really concise. And on August 16, which is a month after Bush had made that quip, they sent a 24-page report to the White House arguing that the place should come to Houston, listing in some detail why Houston was the obvious place, big airport, little airport, a medical center, blah, blah. And then they gave 6 possible locations for where the summit could be held if it were in Texas, in Houston. And this was the Brown Convention Center downtown, the Wortham Center, the summit, University of Houston, Rice, and the Woodlands. I mean, they didn't say where in the world. They just gave those sites. And then they sent this information with these 6 sites, with a very few photographs of the 6 sites, to the White House. A few weeks later, Sig Rogich, that person with the name, unfortunate name, who is a special assistant for special events, calls privately off the record to Lee Hogan and says, "This is too hard for us to give us 6 sites. We can't handle that. Pick out one site and give us one site. Pick out your best site and then make the case for why that should be where it is, because we're dealing with various cities and we can't think about, you know, a bunch of different sites in a bunch of different cities. It's just too many issues." So Hogan, who didn't go to Rice but was a native Houstonian and knew the city, instantly believed that the only location in Houston, the only location in Texas that had the right kind of European ambiance with handsome architecture and arches and tile roof and live oaks that looked European-like, had a sense of sort of eternity about it, was Rice. So Lee Hogan calls George Rupp and said, "Okay, we would like to actually offer Rice as a site of the Economic Summit." And George Rupp, of course, instantly contacted the chairman of the board, Charles Duncan, and they agreed. So the people in Houston decided Houston is the site. So on September the 10th, they sent a very detailed sort of color photo album of Rice to the White House, showing showing the beauty of the Rice campus. In early October, Mayor Whitmire was notified by the White House that 2 cities had been, it was determined there were 2 finalists, Houston and San Antonio. And so now you need to give us more detailed information. So then Lee Hogan and his committee began to accumulate really sort of a mountain of information. I mean, it was a big leather-bound book about this thick that went into unbelievable detail about buses and transportation and catering and health and climate. I mean, every conceivable issue that might come up, they tried to address in this book. And then they sent that leather-bound book with Lee Hogan carrying it and giving it to the White House on November the 7th. Then the next 2 or 3 weeks, Lee Hogan made a number of trips to the White House, going over all the details and answering questions as whoever was making the decision there was considering all the kinds of possibilities. Then, just before Thanksgiving, Lee Hogan's mother was in the hospital for an operation, and he was in the waiting room, or in her room, and he was called for a telephone call. And it was a White House official, Mosbecker, calling him long distance from Mexico, tracking him down to the medical room to ask him one fairly arcane question about one part of the Houston proposal. And Lee Hogan told me he sensed then that it was coming to Rice, because he couldn't figure why in the world would Mosbecker trouble to track him down in a hospital room, you know, just to ask some piece of information.